Šiandienos tema – pažeidžiamumų valdymo sistemos ir praktinis panaudojimas. Šiandienos pranešėjimas Chris Gibbs, mūsų partnerio Tenable saugumo specialistas, 15 metų dirbantis su IT saugumu įvairiose pozicijose. Pažeidžiamumų valdymo sistema leidžia proaktyviai analizuoti tinkle esančių įrenginių saugumo būseną, prioritizuoti įrenginius pagal saugumo spragų kritiškumą ir pateikia rekomendacijas, kaip šias spragas užtaisyti. Po tos atliekant skanavimus galima užtikrinti aukštesnio lygio atsparumą įsilaužimams, informacijos nutekėjimai ir bendrai kenkėjiškai veiklai organizacijoje infrastruktūroje. Noriu informuoti, kad klausimus kviečiame rašyti viso pristatymo metu čia skiltyje, o jos atsakinėsime pristatymo pabaigoje. Chris, I have made a brief introduction, so now the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Today we're going to talk about how you can implement risk-based vulnerability management. And I'm going to go through some slides and talk about the product and show you how it kind of can match up to what we're talking about. If you have any questions, at the end we'll do a questions and answers, so feel free to save those for the end. Okay. So, without further ado, there are typically five stages of implementation for risk-based vulnerability management. And the first thing we need to understand is that this is a lot more comprehensive of a strategy than just traditional vulnerability scanning with a tool like Nessus on its own, for example, or Nmap, for example. Those tools provide you a scan, they provide you the results with CVSS as the primary metric of what do we prioritize. And that's not necessarily the best way to go about things. So we have implemented a tool set within our management platforms, Tenable.io and Tenable SC, that helps customers take a different approach by utilizing what we call vulnerability priority rating. Now, we're going to talk about this throughout this next sort of 45 minutes overall. And we're going to start off with discovery, which is in the far left here, as we can see. So understanding the business environment, building up a plan, that kind of stuff. Then we'll move into assessment. How do you make sure you are assessing everything that you can? What's the best practices there? And then the real key part, the prioritization. How do you prioritize? What metrics can we use to do that prioritization? Through to remediation and fixing the problems that were found, the vulnerabilities that are found. And then measuring how you've been successful. How are you staying up with the KPIs? So let's take a look at some of those steps in more detail. Discovery, like I said, is the first stage. So there's a few things to think about here. We need to understand, most importantly, the business environment. How many assets do you have? What kind of assets are they? And that's what this is all about. And we also need to think about determining and prioritizing the business and critical service applications, services, identifying who owns these devices, and are there any other stakeholders that we need to be speaking to create our policy, our procedure to ensure we are providing the best level of discovery within the environment. Now, there are different tools and technologies available, and technically, for this stage, you could potentially not even use any tools. Okay, like you might have an asset register already that you reference in a CMDB, for example. But from a Tenable perspective, we have our sensors that you would use, that you would deploy to do the initial discovery and assessment. And those sensors are effectively the NESA scanners that are linked to the management tool, IO or SC. In this case, we're going to focus on IO. We have agents, and we have passive scanning technology as well to passively detect new devices and vulnerabilities within the environment. Now, in terms of the processes around this, we have to think about, like I said, what's in scope. What assets do you want to be scanning? And hopefully you have a good idea of that already. But it's important to understand that the scope is a starting point. It doesn't have to be the end stage. It's just where do you want to start from? We need to understand the criticality of our assets. Again, you may know this already. You may have an asset register that contains this information. And if so, great. And use that to be able to add information to your management platform. Then we're going to need to think about defining assessment and remediation requirements. What kind of scans are we going to be doing? Are we going to be doing credentialed scanning? If at all possible, we highly recommend using credentialed scanning because it gives you the best visibility. Are you going to need to deploy sensors, agents, perhaps? Right now, in the world state that we're in, a lot of people are working from home. So, can you do scanning via a network, device, a NESA scanner across the network to your staff? Maybe, but would I recommend it? Scanning through VPNs and that kind of thing? Maybe not. So an agent there makes much more sense to be able to install a local agent and run that agent on the local host and just feed the information back directly. And then by doing all of these things, we're going to be able to address some weaknesses in our environment. Okay. And firstly, we're going to be able to find out the owners of the assets and get the permissions to make sure we have that information available and approval. And we're going to hopefully be able to come to some sort of agreement on scanning and patching windows for the devices that we find. Now, some of the best practices for discovery include, like I said earlier on, define that initial scope. Ideally, that scope is going to be based on available tools and data that you've got. Hopefully you know how many assets you have. Use that as a starting point. You don't have to just go, right, let's scan everything and start from scratch. You have in your mind some idea. Understand that business criticality at this stage is not a deal breaker as well. Discovery means just that, right? We're discovering. We're not doing a full assessment. We're not, determining what vulnerabilities exist. So there's no in-depth scanning that's happening at this stage. So critical infrastructure, not normally a problem, especially when you consider you don't necessarily need any tools to actually do this discovery phase, depending upon what technologies you already have. Discovery scan, for example, though, through Nessus, is the equivalent of just doing a ping almost. If you set it up in the right way, it literally can just be an ICMP ping. So there's not necessarily any major risk to critical infrastructure by doing discovery. Getting the C-level suite buy-in at this stage is really important, though, because it means if you've got that early, and you've got the approval of the C-suite, then moving forward, you shouldn't have any problems when it comes to the project, moving on to the next stages of scanning, remediation. Where possible, we want to be automating the processes. We want to reduce your time manually investigating, manually scanning, right? Use scheduling, use integrations with other tool sets to do things like ticket creation and that sort of stuff. This is all important when it comes to the whole process. Automation is key. It's also important to think about your assets and their life cycle as a whole, though. Just because you bought a machine, you've got to think about when it's going to be taken out as well. How old is it? Has it been patched recently? You want to make sure that you want to keep up to date with your asset life cycle. And your inventory is going to be a living thing. It's not static, generally. You're going to have new devices, new servers, might be physical, might be virtual, hardware on the network. It's not going to stay the same. It's going to grow, it's going to change. You need to be able to kind of handle that. With Tenable IO, it's not a problem. We can handle new assets, we can take that data in and add and remove as needed. We want to make sure that we are able to allow for changes to policy, to be flexible. If you need to stop, scanning a certain network, make sure that's not going to be a major problem for you, for example. And plan for exceptions, because there's always going to be an exception somewhere. Now, from a Tenable perspective, we have a few things when it comes to the asset management. We have standard agents, Nessus scanners that do host discovery, the Nessus network monitor, the passive scanning. And if you have cloud infrastructure, those environments can be very dynamic. New servers get created, taken offline very quickly, very often. And that can be important when it comes to your asset management. You want to be staying on top of the information that's being populated, should we say. Now we have connectors into AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud that allows you to synchronize with the back end, if you like, of those platforms to import the assets. So you scan a device, you start up a new server, rather, for example. We can sell us the import to go every hour, every day, sometimes less than that if you want, to do an import and pull back the latest information about the running assets or the destroyed assets. And you can see here in the screenshot, this is a synchronization process that has happened every hour, for example, in this situation. And we can see it's importing new assets as they're found and putting that into the platform for us. How does that look in the system itself? Well, if I go to my asset list in Tenable IO, I can see the different devices that I've found in my environment. And the key thing I want to talk about right now is the source. This tells us how has it been found? How has this device been found? And I talked about the connectors, and we can easily identify how a device has been connected. Has it been a connector? Has it been a scan? And that might be a discovery scan. It might be a full scan. There's the agent as well to think about. There's an icon for that. So these tools allow you to pull the asset data into the platform. And you can then view the data about those assets. And we'll take a look at this in a bit more detail a bit later on. The next stage in our life cycle here is the assessment. Now, we've done a discovery. We know the assets that we're interested in identifying and scanning. We've deployed our sensors to be able to do those scans, whether that's agents or scanners. And that's where the tools come into play. We have the traditional modern, Nessus scanner, for example. If you have web applications, there's the web application scanning technology for testing public websites or internal websites. If you want to do it in development stage, for example, we have container analysis for images that you may be running Docker or a Docker-based platform. And for the operational technology side of things, we also have a solution to help customers be able to assess their OT infrastructure. Now, I don't say scan because when you say scan to anyone about OT, it brings concerns. So we have a proprietary technology that allows us to safely query OT technology to detect the vulnerabilities that exist in those types of systems. And using them all together, we can then cover the entire attack surface that you might have. Simply upgrading your tools, however, is not enough. Having these modern technologies, these modern tools is great, but if you don't do scanning in the right way, you're not going to have the right information available to you. So this is where the processes come into play. Are we scanning deep enough within the business? And when I say deep enough, what I mean there is, are we using credentials where possible? And are we doing scans with the right policies? Are we doing all of the plugins that we can to get a full picture of the assets? We don't want to leave any blind spots if possible, right? So let's get as much data from the systems as possible, whether that's through credential scanning with the Nessus scanner, web app scanning, agents, the OT, querying. Get as much info as you can out of the asset to ensure that you've got the right information on what you should be looking at in the next stage. Then we have scan frequency. It's a fairly self-explanatory term. Are you scanning regularly enough? To you, that might be quarterly, might be monthly, weekly. There's no right or wrong answer, I guess, when it comes to how often you should scan. But personally, I think that at least once a week for most environments is what I'd recommend. The more frequent, the better, essentially, is the simple answer here. That's not always possible, however. We understand that. So you want to do it as often as you can to provide you the most information. And this is going to help us address a couple of key things. Firstly, the asset visibility. Like I said, by doing credential scanning, you're going to get as much information as possible from those devices. And by having in-depth scanning, by having regular scanning as well, the scan frequency, that's going to help build up our vulnerability management maturity. And that's a really key thing. How mature is our vulnerability management? So if you're just doing scans half a year, quarterly, then chances are you don't have a particularly mature plan when it comes to the vulnerability management. So where possible, scan as often as possible. And we have tools that can help you understand this and identify in your own environment how often are we scanning? Can we improve in any way? By going to the Lumen dashboard here, we can see a few key things. Now, I've been talking about the assessment maturity and scanning depth. So the first thing really is this window here. This tells us our grade compared to our industry and the general population of users of Tenable, for example. Now, Lumen does a lot more than just assessment maturity. It's talking about your cyber exposure risk as a whole, but I'm going to focus right now on assessment maturity. So if I drill into my assessment maturity, I can then see some detail around my business. What is my depth grade scanning level? From A to F, I think it is, maybe D. And that is based upon, like I said, are we doing credential scanning or not? And are we using as many plugins as possible on those devices? The more authenticated, the more plugins you can use in terms of the different scan types and that sort of stuff will increase your scan depth score. And that's what you want to see. You want to be higher than everyone else, really, right? That's the key thing. Then we have our frequency. How often are you how often are you scanning? Every X number of days, weeks, whatever. And again, we can compare that to ourselves and other areas. And we can see how many of our scans are going quarterly, monthly, or how many assets are being scanned on that basis as well. And if there's any recommended actions that we can offer, they'll be at the top here telling you, if you do this, you will increase your score by X%, for example, and move you up to a B or an A or whatever the situation may be. So this tool can be very powerful when it comes to identifying the assessment maturity within the business. Some best practices around assessment. Be flexible. Different technologies require different methods of assessment, hence why we have different tools. A web application, for example, is not going to be any good being scanned by Nessus or OT technology because they're not designed to look at the web application directly. Likewise, Nessus isn't going to be really any good scanning an OT infrastructure because OT infrastructure traditionally doesn't like being queried by the types of scans that Nessus itself will do. So be flexible, use the different technologies available. Okay? Automate wherever possible. As I said earlier on, use the tools in the way they're designed to be used with scheduling and using any automation integrations that you can. You have other technologies in the business that we can integrate with. Perfect. Let's use those technologies. Maybe you have a SIEM, maybe you have a ticketing system, a patch management system. Let's integrate. Let's make things as easy as possible. As I said earlier on, try to assess as frequently as possible. It's going to vary per person. And when it comes to development, if you have any web developers or application developers using things like Docker and containers, where possible, scan early, scan during the development cycle. We can integrate into CI/CD toolings to help assess those environments as well before they get to that public stage. You still want to be scanned them once they're public as well, right? Because new vulnerabilities will come out, but we want to, where possible, scan as early as possible. It just makes sense. Okay, so we've done our assessment, we've done our discovery phases, now we're into the prioritization area. And this is where the predictive prioritization, the vulnerability priority ratings that I kind of talked about a little bit earlier on are going to come into play. So we need to make sure that you are covering as much as possible with as much information as possible to give you the best method of prioritization. Now, like I said earlier on, a lot of companies will traditionally just use Nessus or their tool of choice and scan, and everything's based on CVSS analysis. And CVSS scoring is good, nothing wrong with it, but it's very static. It doesn't change particularly. So something that was critical a year ago may not be critical now, but you're going to be told by CVSS this is critical. We can identify that in the platform. But it's not just vulnerability criticality that we have to think about. You need to think about business criticality as well. You have assets in your business, you know how critical they are to you. Maybe it's a server, maybe it's a firewall, maybe it's a CEO's laptop or the head of HR. These different devices will have different business criticalities that will impact how quickly you remediate the vulnerabilities on those as well, not just because you're told this is critical. If a system is effectively not available to anyone other than you as an admin, for example, it's a server only accessible by SSH from a specific IP address, but it's got critical vulnerabilities. Do you need to get to those straight away? Probably not, because the business criticality will be a lot lower. So there's always things to think about. Now, from a tools and technologies perspective, we have the vulnerability management platform, the intelligence feeds that are being utilized in the background, and if you have other toolings, they may offer additional threat intelligence feeds. You might have your configuration maintenance and management database, and you can use our toolings to do some of those analysis of configuration audits with the CIS configuration checks. You have machine learning that's happening in the background to provide these predictive technologies, the scoring and information that we're going to look at in a second. Now, when it comes to the predictive modeling, you need to make sure that that data is going to be regularly updated, right? Regularly refreshed. CVSS is not. Like I said, it stays static for pretty much most of the time. Occasionally it will change, but for the most part, it stays static. With VPR and predictive prioritization, we update our feeds, our data every night. So you get new information on a regular basis. This is going to help us address a few weaknesses in the environment. So we're going to be able to identify specific considerations that we need to have for different types of machines, location devices, the owner, like I said, maybe a certain owner's device has a higher priority or a lower priority, for example. And it's going to help us build policies to support internal assessment service life agreements, service level agreements, rather. So how does that look in the console? And I have a couple of screenshots, but I'm going to go into the actual console and show you a live system. So if we jump to back to our assets, right? And I talked about the asset criticality being a consideration. Now you can see in the middle here, the ACR and some numbers. ACR stands for Asset Criticality Rating, right? And if I look at this device here, it's a Windows server. It's been given a criticality of 8. Well, when we do scans, what we do is we identify what is that device, what is it doing, what's installed on it, and we will use that information to provide our initial score. And we can see it down here, device type, its capabilities, and its exposure. So how have we seen it? Was it an internal scan or an external scan? What's running on it? In this case, it has the IT management system running on it. It might be a domain controller. It might be a database server. And then what is the device type? Is it firewall? Is it a server? Is it a workstation? That kind of stuff. Using all of that and a few other things that happen in the background will determine an initial criticality, but we don't know your environment. So we just make an educated guess based on what we see. you may say, well, actually, this server is, its attack surface is very minimal. Like I said, maybe it's only available to just you with firewalling, and the ports are all closed apart from the management port. So the actual chance of attack is very limited. So perhaps you might actually edit the score to make it a lower level, or vice versa. Maybe you make it more critical because it's a more critical device. In this case, for example, we have a laptop, which traditionally would probably have a fairly middle range score, 5 to 6 perhaps. But maybe it's the head of HR's laptop, and the head of HR is likely to be, more susceptible to phishing attacks. So we can then say, okay, well, let's look at this and increase the score for this user. Okay, that can be updated through the GUI or through the API. The other criticality is the vulnerability criticality. So each vulnerability is given a VPR score. I'm going to just jump to the actual vulnerabilities list here. And what we can see here is that we have our severity here. This is a CVSS severity. We also have a VPR severity. And what we can see is that a lot of the CVSS sort of critical vulnerabilities don't really have critical VPR scores. They're medium, they're high. So you don't necessarily need to pay attention to those today. They can be dealt with at a later stage. So we can see here, for example, this flash update. If I look at the VPR key drivers here, in terms of the background information that we're checking, like I said, we do this on a nightly basis. And this is done with 150 data points we analyze. There's no activity, no sources we've seen activity in. There's not been any in the last week. Intensity is very low. There's not been any, effectively. Exploit code is basically unproven, unknown. So do I need to fix this? No. And in reality, Flash Player is probably not going to be required much longer, right? Websites aren't really using Flash. It's going end of life. So would I patch it? Probably not. I'd probably just remove it. By comparison, if I was to filter my information and say, okay, well, let's just look at the critical VPR vulnerabilities, and I pick on this one here, Bluekey. Quite well known. We can see here that actually there's a lot of activity been going on. We've seen a lot of activity in different sources, hacker forums, dark web, social media, all these kinds of places. And it's been happening very recently. The exploit code maturity is also high. We can see that here. It can be exploited with core impact, metasploit, malware, simple tools that people can just effectively use themselves. It doesn't require any major difficulty to potentially take advantage of this vulnerability here. So would I prioritize this? Quite likely, yes. But again, the asset criticality will also play a part in that decision-making process. So, best practices here. As I said, prioritization should be based upon the vulnerability, risk, and the business criticality. I've said this a couple of times. VPR is in my opinion, a much better way of defining what's important to you today to take action against than CVSS alone. Goes without saying. Again, I come back to the automation. Automate as much as possible. Integrate with CMDBs, ticketing systems, Seams, patch management tooling, whatever you've got, we have a fairly large list of integration partners available on our website, and we have an open API as well. If you've got buy-in early from the asset owners and from the C-suite, for example, and business leaders, then this will help you again, at this stage, get the alignment with the risk tolerance of the business. Are you happy to accept a risk? Maybe you can't patch it, so you're just going to accept that risk and not worry about it. You accept it or make it a lower level, and because you can't fix it. We want to ensure that anything we are providing people in terms of remediation kind of planning, that the output that we're giving them is actionable. Can we actually take an action on what we're being told? Is this patch available? Can we push it out? Those kinds of things. Then we have our remediation. So once we've identified the priority, we're going to get into the remediation steps. This stage, we're going to be taking advantage of, obviously, our platform. We've already got the information around the vulnerability. We've got the solution information provided to us. And hopefully, we're going to be able to integrate to a ticketing system to automatically populate that ticketing system with the devices, the vulnerabilities that need patching, right? And have that automatically assigned to different users based upon asset ownership or whatever it might be. Determining the process of which ones get patched first, which vulnerabilities are remediated first, is part of that prioritization, right? So we've identified the ones we want to fix, but not everything can be fixed straight away. So maybe you have another method you can mitigate against. Maybe an IPS, for example. So determining the right action is also part of the process you're going to go through to identify what do we do at this stage. Maybe it's patch, maybe it's take the system offline. There's all kinds of different options available. And this will help us address any weaknesses when it comes to agreeing the response plan. Hopefully we can get that locked in, identify, right, well, this is the process we're going to take on an ongoing basis. And that will help us build out an effective remediation process for the ongoing future as well. Now, in the platform, what we can do is we can set up filters when we're looking at our vulnerability assessment. And in this case, it's set up to look for any application that has Microsoft in it. So we're creating a filter to search for Microsoft application vulnerabilities. And this might be one of the ways you go about doing some of the prioritization, some of the patch management. You target a specific application, a specific tool set, and we fix those first, for example. It's a very simple thing to do to create the filters. If you use Nessus, you may already use this, or if you use IO, you may already use the filters. There's lots of options available to you to create these custom views and custom filtering options to target those specific things. You might do Linux, you might do Adobe, you might do all kinds of different options. If a CP exists and we can find it, then you can target it with that particular method. But like I say, there are lots of filter options available. When it comes to looking at the actual assessment side of things, this is a slightly older screenshot, but we can see here that the system has been assessed, we found a vulnerability, and we've done the check by looking at the file version. We've logged into the system, we've looked at the file version of Adobe in this case, and we've identified it's outdated, therefore is vulnerable to this specific vulnerability. Now, you may have a patch management tool like SCCM, WSUS, Big Fix, there's all kinds of obviously providers out there. And depending upon what you have will depend on the level of integration we have available. So with SCCM, WSUS, for example, we can do a check against the patch management tooling and say, does it think the patch needs applying? And we can see in the case in the second post here, Denise, the SCCM is reporting the system as not vulnerable, even though we can see the file version is outdated. So you can sanity check, you can verify, does the patch management tool think the system needs patching or not? So it's not just us saying, yep, here's everything, this is what it is. You can verify against a patch management tool, for example, to check it and see, is it reporting the right information? Because if you're relying purely on SCCM to tell you you're vulnerable or not, clearly it's flawed. Now, there can be different reasons. Maybe you have installed the patch, but you've not rebooted. Maybe you've installed the patch, but you've not made a registry change that needs doing. There can be different scenarios as to why you're seeing this mismatch of information, but why not take advantage of it if you can? Some best practices for remediation. Where possible, try and address large categories of vulnerabilities. If a single patch will remove a large chunk of vulnerabilities, we have a view that tells you that, it's called the solutions view in the platform. That is a big win, right? You can get a lot of things resolved by just doing 1 or 2 patches. Great, do it. Again, automate, integrate with SCCM, integrate with any patch management tool you've got, right? If you can, if it supports our integrations. Identify the remediation step beyond patching. Like I said, you have scenarios where it's more than just install the patch. Maybe you've got a reboot. Maybe you've got to push out a registry key change via group policy or something as well. Identify those problems early so that when it comes to doing your scans in the following set, you don't still have a vulnerability that technically you fixed, but you haven't quite got there. That adds some confusion because you then think, oh, I fixed this. But in reality, you've not followed the full steps. Understand business dependencies. Just because you can patch something doesn't mean you should. Would that patch impact another system? Would it impact another software on that system? So sometimes you have to accept risk rather than patching, for example. So understand that business risk, the business dependencies on that host, that system, before going all in and patching everything, for example. Remove unnecessary software. I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory, as I said a minute ago with Flash, for example. Flash is going to be end of life. Let's just remove it, right? No one really uses it anyway. So remove unnecessary software. Doesn't need to be there. Let's get rid of it. Takes away a risk, right? And when you deploy a new system, try and get it as up to date as possible so that when it goes out, it's at the best position from a security perspective. Harden the OS if you can. Those kinds of things. And then we need to measure our system. And there's dashboards, there's templates available, there's reporting to help us do this. It might be using the tooling we provide, or it might be using a scene to do some of this reporting. It's going to help you build up, KPIs and keeping to a consistent system to provide the right information to the right people. CISO, for example, isn't going to necessarily want to see the same thing that the engineer fixing the vulnerabilities is going to want to see. They might want a more high level, for example. We have different dashboards that provide different views depending upon the requirement. I showed you Lumen earlier on. This works very well in C-suite kind of situations where The business needs to understand the overall risk rather than each vulnerability, for example. Then we have things like the container, the web application, custom dashboards that you create, dashboards that can help us mitigate by measuring how we're doing from a remediation perspective. Mitigation summary dashboard, for example, is a really good view around that, right? So if I just come down to my mitigation summary, this will help us see we have addressed this many vulnerabilities by mitigating them. We still have this many to mitigate. And out of that percentage is exploitable or has a patch that's older than 30 days and just broken down to different views. We can filter these against specific systems if you need to, that kind of thing. So you can have multiple versions of dashboards. You can fully, create your own custom dashboard if you want by incorporating widgets from different views. There's lots of options when it comes to handling that. Some best practices around measuring. Well, where possible, tie the metrics back to policies and procedures internally. Do you have a certain SLA around how quickly critical patches are dealt with? Use that information. Use the data at this stage to help you learn and improve the earlier stages where possible. Try and be as consistent as possible by providing reporting on a regular basis and keeping to the same theme to people that need to have it where possible again. Add in metrics where possible from the assessment stage. Is it useful to provide specific data on a specific vulnerability to a certain stakeholder, for example? Determine that appropriate view as well. Like I said, Lumen's a really good view for a C-suite type user, whereas the vulnerability assessment view is probably not going to be quite as relevant. Each person in the business will have their own need, and we can normally provide a view to help with that. And then just be prepared to be able to handle maintenance cycles, ad hoc patching, where required. Don't always rely on a certain day for patching. If you need to have some flexibility, be able to do it. It's important. So here we are, back at the end of the journey. We've gone from discovery through to assessing, prioritizing, remediating, and measuring. I hope you've found the session useful. If you have any questions, then we'll now open up for a questions and answers section. Thank you very much for your time. Okay. You're on mute, Konstantin.
Sorry. Yes, thank you for this detailed presentation and informative. Yes, and as I see here, there is one question: how vulnerability ratings values are defined based on NIST and VD-CVA?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it depends on what we're talking about, which score, right? Are we talking the CVSS score, or are we talking DPR? CVSS is traditionally based on people like NVD, sure, those kind of people who provide the traditional CVSS scorings for the various vulnerabilities that are published. They are publicly available, sources. The VPR score, our score, is our internal own scoring. So we take the CVSS initial score, and we then add the extra 150 or so metrics to enrich the system, right, to provide you a more defined score. The interesting thing with CVSS, so you have like CVEs, obviously you have the MVD. You have CVSS version 2, version 3, 3.1, and in some cases you'll have a situation where CVSS version 2 and version 3 don't match up, right? So which one do you follow? Do you go with CVSS, which is telling you it's a medium, but version 3 says it's critical? That can add some confusion, whereas VPR will give you just a single score telling you, based on what we're seeing today, this is what we think. Hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, see Darius is typing something, so we can still wait a little bit.
Of course.
What specific criteria are you adding?
Sure. So there's a big list, like I said, 150 data points. And I don't have the full list. They don't tell me, let alone everyone else, right? But the things we'll look at will include things like exploitability. How easy is that? I showed you in the slideshow. Can an exploit be utilized right now to take advantage of this vulnerability? What sources are people talking? We monitor the dark web. We monitor hacker forums and social media and mainstream media and various other sources to look for people talking about these vulnerabilities or maybe taking action against them, for example. We'll look at the number of solutions that are impacted by that vulnerability. If it's just a single application compared to 10, 15, 20 applications that we impacted, that will impact the scoring level. But the key things are the sources we're seeing people talking about it and how exploitable it is at this stage. I might get us to get a white paper or something sent out to you, which might have some more data if you're really interested in knowing the sort of the ins and outs. But there's a certain amount we don't give out even to internal staff like myself. So yeah.
Okay, so I see Darius is still typing. One more question, maybe.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, we can wait. He would like to read your paper. So Darius, you can write me an email, and I will send you this white paper.
Yes. Yeah, I'll see what I can find that we are providing publicly, and I'll get that across to.
Okay, good. So yes, thank you, Chris, and we will finish this webinar. Dėkui visiems, kad prisijungėte, išklausėte, tikiuosi parsinešite gerųjų praktikų pas save įmonėje ir jas pritaikysite. Ir iki visi. Bye, everyone.
Bye.